Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Homiletics. Our topic for this coming week, the week where we have class on November 12th, is exegeting the congregation. So who are these people that you are talking to? We're going to have two videos. The first one is going to be me talking about the Nora Tubbs Tisdale book. And her whole theology and practice of congregational exegesis and interpretation. And then Dr. Jefferson is going to lead us in a conversation about what the implications of that framework might be. So I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about Tisdale and what she is doing in her book. Preaching as Local Theology and Folk Art is the book. So this topic, if you think of the sort of sacramental structure of the course, you've got the taking, the blessing, the breaking, and the giving of the word. The taking was kind of like the piece about the preacher's identity, the autobiography, the testimony, the matrix. The blessing was the last couple of weeks having to do with spirituality of preaching, letting the Spirit, because the blessing is the coming of the Spirit upon the elements. So this coming of the Spirit upon us is our spirituality of preaching, our relationship with God, and then the use of our creativity and the arts, which is what we've been doing the last couple of weeks. The breaking, which is this next part, really has to do with the sort of opening up of preaching of the self to the world. So the first part of that is to your immediate congregation, the people you're talking to. And then next week, we're going to talk about the world, and we're going to talk about preaching in the public square, prophetic preaching, that sort of thing. But this topic is about the congregations. It's about these people that you are talking to. Tom Long talks about in his book the fact that we are sent to preach on behalf of a community. So we're sent to Scripture on behalf of a community. And in doing so, we are listening to their lives as well as listening to the text. And if you think back to Tom Long's models of preaching, the role of the congregation is different in each model. The Harold model, the Karl Barth model, is more the sort of you've got the word and you give it to the congregation. The pastor model is more you are listening and you are responding from the beginning to the needs of the congregation. There's a convener model where you're really sort of making a conversation happen among the community. So the role of the community varies. And when you work on your own metaphor, be thinking about where's the congregation in your metaphor and how do you bring them in at what point. But the main point to make to start with is just that sermons are a communal creation. They're not a solo performance. So they emerge out of a context. They respond to a context. And they give voice to the words and the prayers and the thoughts of the community to a large extent. So then the question is, how do you listen to the community? How do you do that? And so here's where Tisdale has a really interesting framework that she uses, and that is the idea of communities as cultures. So she talks about how in some ways we are like every human being, like we're born, we die, we breathe, we have desires, we have needs, etc. We're also in some ways unlike other people. Everyone is unique, and so you're not like, there's nobody that's like you and you're not like anyone. But in some ways you are like other people, and in those ways that you're like other people, you form kind of a common culture with them. And so culture is sort of a set of common norms, ways of being, worldviews, values, ethos, often unspoken kinds of sense of how we relate to each other and what it means that we are together and what we share with each other. And you're probably aware of all of this intuitively, even if you haven't thought about it in terms of the sort of almost anthropological lens that Tisdale brings, which is that when you walk into different churches, you just get a sense of a different sort of way of being that each community has. There's a different feel, there's a different tone, and that speaks to the culture of the community. And Tisdale's work started from the awareness that when she started out preaching, she was really preaching across cultures. And she didn't even realize it to start with, that she moved from an urban environment out to a rural environment, and she found that her sermons were not connecting, and it was partly because her cultural framework was very different from people she was talking to. And that was sort of what spurred her to really try to understand how to exegete, how to interpret congregational cultures. What she comes up with are strategies for exegeting congregations that do come from the field of anthropology. This idea that what you're looking for is what she calls a symbolic analysis of a culture. That is to look for the particular governing symbols that really disclose who these people are, what makes them tick, what their values are, what their worldview is, how they look at the world. That you're looking for a way to make what they call a thick description of this community, in terms of all of those questions, and that the way you do it is by looking at a symbol. So in page 3 of the sermon journal, we asked you to actually do that with your congregation. That is to pick a symbol and to interpret it. And symbols can take all kinds of different forms. So a person, a very important person in the community, can be symbolic. That person can symbolize what the congregation is all about. Or it could be an event. It could be a thing that happens every year, or the way that they do coffee hour, or something like that. It could be an architectural feature, something that's in the chapel, in the church. It could be some sort of ritual that takes place. It could be some story that people tell over and over again that discloses who these people are and how they see themselves. You might ask yourself, when you are thinking about symbols, congregational symbols, if we were in class together, I would ask you, what are the symbols of BTS? So what are the things that disclose our worldview and values and ethos as a community? I would say that one of them is probably the architecture of these buildings, the way that all of them have this very similar sort of brick pattern. They sort of echo some of the famous brick buildings in Virginia, like Mount Vernon and Monticello. And when we build new buildings on campus, they always are exactly like that. And even, when we built our new chapel, the idea was, we're not going to create a chapel that looks radically different. We're going to create a chapel that looks just like all these brick buildings that it's around. So what are we saying when we use that architecture, and then we keep reproducing it over and over again, even when we're creating new buildings? What does that say? So the architecture, I think, is one of the symbols of this community. I think it's also architectural. Walk into the refectory and you see all those worthies on the wall. And even once we renovated the refectory, we still put all those portraits back up again. So what are we saying when we have all of these sort of admirable or less than admirable folk who used to be part of the seminary? That is a sort of symbolizing thing. So you could just go on. You could think of people. You could think of certain professors or certain staff members who are sort of symbolize the ethos of this place, or maybe stories. The story of the chapel burning down gets told over and over again. That seems to symbolize, it's a traumatic story, but it also, we tell it because it tells us something. Perhaps it tells us how much we value our history and how much we mourn the loss of a beautiful place, which of course would be true for any community. But there is something about that story that just keeps coming back up. So these are symbols. I would say, if you take another example from across the street, Emmanuel Church on the Hill, first thing you say about that church is the pumpkin sales every October for the whole month. That defines that community, and they're so proud of it. But that tells you something about who they are. They want to think of themselves as working together, as caring about service and outreach, as having fun, as being able to do a big thing together, all of those sorts of things. So those are symbols that disclose the nature of the community. You can probably think of some in your field site parishes or in your home parishes that are symbolic. So, and of course, one thing that Tisdale points out is some symbols disclose who the community is, and some disclose who the community wants to be. And there just sometimes there's a disconnect between who they say they are and what really is going on. But the symbols can be aspirational sometimes. So we want you to use this lens to look at your communities and to think about how you come to understand them. And then when you think about all of that, you then think about, well, okay, then how do I preach to this community, knowing who they are and how they think, and having done this kind of ethnographic sort of research. And Tisdale mentions of various options. She says sermons can affirm current values and practices. They can stretch, so sermons can stretch, take what people know and believe and try to move them forward. Sermons can invert the worldview of the community, turn it upside down. Sermons can challenge or judge the worldview, the values of a community. And a sermon can help envision worlds that we don't yet see. So those are some of the, it's sort of almost a continuum between like really saying, great, you guys are great, what you're doing is wonderful, to moving people along, to actually trying to judge and transform or reimagine. And those are some layers of response to the congregational exegesis that you've done. And then she has a set of questions in her book, actually at page 105, which we asked you to think about with your page 3 of your sermon journal, which is questions like, what would the people in this congregation doubt to be true about the text? Where would they get hung up? What do they need to know or be reminded of in this text? And what are the inner feelings and longings and thoughts and desires of these people that this text responds to? And then she has a question that isn't so much about the congregation, but if this text is true, what's the kind of world we live in? And if this text is not true, what's the kind of world we live in? That's not so much about the congregation, but it's a nice question. So those are some of the frameworks that Tisdale lays out that I think are helpful. Her initial point in this book is that people have done in the world of homiletics a ton of work and writing about hermeneutics, interpreting biblical texts, and about theology, the use of doctrine, but they haven't done as much work on interpreting congregations. So her work is an attempt to rectify that, and others have followed in her footsteps. But we want that to be a piece of how you think about preaching, that it's not a one-way street. It emerges from and responds to a particular community. And you might also think, to what extent are you preaching across cultures in your field site parishes? Did you find yourself in a community that's culturally quite similar to yours? Or did you find yourself in a community that's very, very different? And how do you make the adjustments that are needed to be preaching in a place that perhaps is different from the culture that you yourself are part of, or your understanding of what a church is or what a church ought to be? But those are the considerations that will make you a successful preacher. Now, I want to bring my colleagues in at this point to, I know that Dr. Jefferson is going to lead us through thinking about the implications of these questions for our preaching in our different contexts. But what would the two of you be interested in adding about the kind of overall topic that we're addressing, and ways that you think about interpreting and exegeting congregations? So I start with Professor Turner.
Well, I just want to add 2 things to what you said, or just to build on what's in the Nora Tubbs Tisdale book. And one of them is a piece of advice that I feel like I have heard many times and may have been uttered in this course already, but that the sermon you preach should not make sense at another time and place. That if your preaching is not specific to the moment and to the place that it is preached, it probably something is missing. And that's why a lot of preachers, myself included, wouldn't ever reuse a sermon, because it's ideally so embedded in the culture and the moment of the people to whom it is preached. So it's just one principle to hold in mind. The other little bit of nuance to what you said, Ruthanna, about reading a place's symbols, culture. You mentioned it being aspirational. It's often not what people think it is. And so coming in as an anthropologist, so you mentioned that discipline, there is the idea of looking for what people are actually communicating versus what they think they are communicating. I know I've talked about this recently. I don't think it was in here, but the Ship of Fools mystery worshiper. If you're not familiar with this website, it's just very funny and it's church humor. But they have a program called the Mystery Worshiper, where they send people into a church and they rate the church, and it's very funny. But it also points out that oftentimes what when we're in churches, what we think we're saying, the Episcopal Church welcomes you. Oh, right, except you have to have a car to drive here, and when you walk in, no one greets you. Maybe we don't welcome you as much as we think we do. So when you're attending to culture, just to have that care to come in with kind of a naive eye and an anthropologist's eye, so that you can see more than what people think they're telling you.
Dr. Jefferson.
Listening to how you were able to summarize Tisdale's thought, it took me to two different places. So there's a kind of like a homiletical part, and then there's more of like the actual preaching part. So on the homiletical part, in my mind, I was able to see how preaching theory evolves, because you see who passes on stuff to who passes on stuff to who. So my advisor was her advisor, just many years apart. And then looking at the projects that certain people produce over the course of their years, and the people who produce projects out of like interest, it's just fascinating to see how streams of thought and how people find that, and how we're influenced by the people who influenced the people that we've been influenced by. So I had kind of a strange and serendipitous moment, just kind of like thinking about not just that relationship, like, we're teaching out of Tom Long's book, and then we have Tisdale here. It's just interesting to see the trajectory of thought, because my thought, adding on to Tisdale's thought, is that her work was necessary because, and I don't want to speak to her overall academic critiques in terms of her commitments to feminism and the like, but she offers a feminist critique in many ways to the way the establishment has contextualized or decontextualized homiletics. The homiletics was wrestling with the obscurities of theology and doctrine and some of the other ancillary inside baseball maneuvers and techniques. And so she, as an outsider in many ways, is having to think about what does it mean to be an insider and outsider. So she's an insider because she's at seminary, so she has a culture, she has a WASP culture. So there's an insideness that she has, but she's also an outsider, which I think made her aware of the ways in which context is important. So to her credit in this work, she invites us to think differently about what has preaching been emphasizing all these years, a decontextualized homiletic. So on one hand, she helps to rectify that in the literature of homiletics by addressing the importance of it and a way to remedy that, which is a folk option. So my work kind of makes a similar move, so I can understand that. Where I hope that we can build, and we'll talk more about this in the next video, which is where are the contextual spaces left unattended, or how do we apply Tisdale's work to the macro context? How do we apply Tisdale's work to how we assess a nation? How do we apply this context to how do we assess empire? How do we take these observations and these tools and assess larger contextual understanding, so that we can then begin to have a broadness of imagination about how does preaching speak to the local level and the international context, because technology's put us in such a place where your sermon is to the 25 people at your parish on Zoom, but at the same time, it can be watched halfway across the world 7 years from now. So there is a specificity of context that allows one to be relevant, but there's also a broadness of context in which one must understand that their conversation, their interpretation is being placed into. And so just keeping these tensions alive, I think is a healthy process in terms of thinking about Tisdale and what she's offering us in terms of having a preaching that's informed by Anglican identity that is sensitive to the context where it's received. And I think if we embrace it that way, I think we'll be better suited. So thank you for that.
Great. That's wonderful. Yeah, those are big, wonderful points. And I just also particularly lift up what Dr. Jefferson just said about the feminist nature of this, that it is a different theology of preaching than the sort of standard model that was much more about the preacher. But to really lift up the fact that everybody is intrinsically part of this sermon, the whole assembly. And that it also links up with the focus in liturgical theology about it's not just the priest or the minister who's performing the liturgy, but the whole assembly is actively involved. And that's true for preaching as well, even though it feels often like a solo performance, but in fact, it's really not. Okay, that's enough for that video. So we'll say goodbye and then we'll come back with another one where we look at the implications of Tisdale in our own work.